All right, what is up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Thursday, October 7th of 2021. Almost forgot what day of the week it was here, but thank you for tuning into the stream. Whether you're watching me live here or listening to or watching this back as a recording after, appreciate you being here, supporting the stream. If this is your first time watching our stream here, this is a live Q&A style show where I answer questions from SaberSim users about SaberSim, about DFS, whatever you guys want to talk about. It is one of the best times of the year right now, and it is about to get even better because there are so many different sports to play DFS for. So I know obviously going to be a ton of football content to talk about, but we're doing baseball playoffs here now. So we've got some of these little baseball slates and showdowns and things like that to talk about. Golf, obviously, every Thursday. We've got NBA tipping off in 2 weeks now, NHL next week. So just a really fun time to play DFS and a lot of different sports to talk about. If you missed it yesterday, I had Max on stream here. We were talking about how to conduct research, turn it into a cheat sheet or a deliverable or something that you can actually use, and then how to use that research to apply and add some additional value to SaberSim. That video... Obviously, we did that show live, but that video now is up on our YouTube page under strategy sessions here, the 3 steps to better NFL DFS research. So go check that out if you watch a lot of videos or listen to podcasts or read articles as you're leading up to an NFL slate like I do. I think probably most of us here, especially those of you that are watching this stream, probably do that. This video, I think, will help maybe give you a little bit of an action plan of how you can turn that research really into notes and into a cheat sheet and then apply that more effectively into SaberSim on game day. So definitely check that out. As always, if you watch it and have any questions for either me or Max, feel free to pop those questions into Slack, and we will be around here all week and weekend, keeping an eye on things and answering questions as they come in. So let's see. One other announcement here. I always want to plug our, let's see. Let me find it here. Our Max Challenge, right? So contests start to fill up as we get into the later parts of the week. So make sure you are joining up on that 50-cent mini-max or the 5-cent pooch punt contest for the NFL Sunday main slate on FanDuel or DraftKings. Wear the SaberSim logo on those sites, max the contests out. You get the opportunity to play those contests again for free the following week after we do our giveaways on Mondays. But also, if you are the highest scoring SaberSim avatar in that contest, you have an opportunity to win some additional swag. So we've been finding that there's probably about 60 to 80 consistent people participating in this year week to week, which is awesome. But I mean, put another way, you are basically, competing against 60 or 80 so people for a ticket to a much bigger contest, a free month of SaberSim, and entry to a big free roll at the end of the season. So even that alone, forget all the other awesome bonuses of playing in this contest, is just totally worth it. But definitely get into those contests because I know they start to fill up fast, and they are worth playing. So anyway, I've got a few questions here for us today. A few questions have come in through Slack and support over the last 24 hours. As always, I do this show live for a reason. So if you have questions as I am talking through anything, pop them into YouTube chat, pop them into the Office Hours channel in Slack. Or if you have thoughts that you want to share on a specific topic or question, please pop them into the chat, and I'll pull some of these comments and questions up on screen here as they come in. So anyway, cool. Let's go ahead and jump in. I'm going to start back here. Let's see. I'm going to start with this question that came in from support here. And we will go ahead and kick it off here. So this came in from Dan in support. And Dan said, I've been playing every NFL showdown slate, 20 max, $3, and every main slate, $3, 20 max, and my results haven't been as good as I hoped. I think my biggest issue is knowing how and when to tinker. Your suggestions for manipulating the pool. I know you can't just take what it spits out and enter, but how much tinkering is too much? For last night's showdown, that was the first one that I actually... I think these came in a little bit backwards. Made a little profit, which may be a sign of me starting to get the ownership levels correct. I've been playing DFS for a long time, so I know you can't just expect to jump in and start winning right off the bat. Was curious about some strategies of player pool manipulation. I think this got jumbled up pasting this in, but I get the idea here, right? And I mean, one thing I want to just mention here right at the start is that from a contest selection strategy here, Dan, you may be able to actually add a little bit of value and give yourself a better ROI over the long term, spreading this out a little bit more. While the $3.20 max contests grade out very well just in a vacuum, right? The payout structure of that contest is pretty good. It has over 1,000 effective entrants, which is exactly what we like. It's a pretty strong contest to play overall. If you're playing about $60, you may find that there is a better way to spread that out. I mean, just as a starting point, playing the dime, the quarter, and the $1 is only going to be $27 of tickets, of entries, but you're going to triple the number of lineups you can get compared to 20. Right. So you just, I mean, immediately have 3 times as many shots at that high score. You're going to spread out your variance a little bit more. 20 lineups is better than 1 lineup for sure, but it's still, you're going to be pretty exposed on a week-to-week basis, even playing every showdown and every main slate with just 20 lineups. So one thing I would recommend, if you haven't already seen it, and maybe you have, but I would recommend checking out this video here in our strategy sessions. And it is how to double your NFL DFS ROI in 15 minutes. This is all about contest selection and bankroll management. I'd recommend checking this out. I know you mentioned you've been playing DFS for a long time. So if you really love those $3.20 maxes and want to stick with them, totally go for it. But that was the first thing that jumped out to me is, especially in a sport like NFL, where you only have so many playable slates, one thing that you can do to just give yourself a lot more shots on goal is to just drop down in stakes and spread out a little bit more. Like I'm envisioning here, let's actually just do this real quick. Well, no, you know what? We'll stick to the question. But if you play the 10 cent, the dime 20 max, the 25 cent 20 max, the $1 20 max, the $1 3 max, the $1 single entry, the $3 single entry, the $3 single 3 max, you're going to add up to about $60, probably pretty close, but have like 75 lineups instead of just 20, that you just have a lot more opportunity to build that high upside lineup. What is also nice about that is you're also going to have a lot more opportunity to be a little bit more nuanced with your exposure. So the actual question here, let's go ahead and run our first test build of the day here. So the actual question is, we're assuming we're going to be building lineups for a contest like this, 20 max over 50K entrance. We're just building 20. We'll do a pool of 500. And the question is, how much editing exposures make sense for your particular set of lineups? And the reality here is that editing your exposures is probably more going to have an impact on your risk and your variance of your lineups than it is necessarily going to have an impact on your ROI or your profitability, actually. Unless you're being very intentional about fading or increasing exposure to specific plays because it leads you to more positive expected value lineups, right? Lowering your max exposure is really just going to be a way of spreading out your risk, lowering your variance. And that can still be valuable if you if you're more concerned with trying to get more, you're trying to spread out your risk a little bit. You don't want to be all in on a certain few players. I think it makes a lot of sense. The easiest way to do this, or the easiest way to think about this, is to look at this leverage column. We just added this year. I love this thing. I think about it and use it pretty heavily in my individual process. And all it is it's taking your exposure minus the projected ownership for a player. It's showing you how over or how above the field you are or under the field you are on a certain player. And it allows you to quantify what your most important plays are on the slate. So this is a really good example, right? We clearly like Davante Adams this week. We think he's going to be extremely chalky at this point, but he is by far our favorite play on the slate in this particular pool of 20 lineups. Now, what is interesting to me here and what stands out immediately is that Davante Adams is almost double our next highest exposed play, right? And the other thing that is interesting here is that our most negatively leveraged play is only negative 18%. And our highest potentially negatively leveraged play would be minus 38%. So in other words, if we completely faded Davante Adams, the most negative leverage we could gain on any player in the entire pool would be negative 38%, which stands out to me. That's kind of just a lot of the way I like to think about this and ground this conversation. This stands out to me that we are possibly by default a bit over leveraged on Adams, right? I don't know, even if I were to do my research and found that I really liked Adams as a play, I'm not sure if I would necessarily think that he was twice, or I guess this is closer to like 1.5 times my favorite play on the entire slate compared to every other player in the pool. Now, this could be a very good opportunity to reduce some of your ownership to a play like this, maybe just down to 70% or something like that. That kind of places him a little bit closer to other players here. We're still well over the field on the chalkiest player on the slate, but we've kind of brought this down a little bit because we don't need 65 percentage points of leverage on this one particular play. And again, now, is this making our pool of lineups more profitable? Is this increasing the ROI or the expected value of this set of 20 lineups? Probably not. Or probably not necessarily. It's probably a neutral EV move in this particular case, but it's spreading out our risk a little bit and making it so we are not 100% invested to a play that we maybe potentially don't have to be well enough over the field on that player. And that's kind of the way I like to think about these. So now, I mean, Leonard Fournette stands out a little bit here, not as much, but maybe we were to drop him down a little bit, 65%. And we're kind of pulling this leverage. We're making this look a little bit more flat. So we still have plays that we like, right? Our favorite plays on the slate are Fournette and Cooper and Adams and Joe Burrow, but we're not exceptionally high over leverage to one of these players more than another. And none of these players we don't have significantly more positive leverage on a given player than we could possibly get negative leverage on the highest owned player in the pool. I like that in general rule of thinking about your leverage in general. Is like, what's the most leverage I could gain out of fading any one player in the pool? Well, it would be a full fade of Devontae Adams, who's about 38% owned. So do I need to get more positively leveraged on any given player in the pool? Probably not. And it lets you kind of spread out your risk. Now, it's not the only way to do it. It's not the only way to think about this. This is a way of spreading out your risk. There's some players that want to increase their risk, right? They want to condense their player pool and may have the opposite approach here. But this would be a good way of thinking about this. I did want to touch on just one point that I had mentioned here. So I'm going to reset my exposures real quick and talk a little bit more about how maybe why playing more lineups is actually going to just give you more. It's going to one, give you a greater percent chance of having that high scoring lineup, which I think people kind of just understand intuitively, but it also allows you to get more nuance here with your individual exposure. So you could see here, right, with 20 lineups, we're stuck limiting these by buckets of like 5. So we can have Devontae Adams, or we can have Devontae Adams in 75% of our lineups. We can have him in 70% of our lineups. We can't have him in 72.5% of our lineups. When you start to increase the number of lineups you are playing, you do get the opportunity to be a little bit more nuanced with how these numbers actually interact and what percentage of lineups you can actually roster players in. So say you were playing, again, those 3 20 maxes instead and a handful of single entries and 3 maxes instead of just this one big 20 max. With 75 lineups, right, we get a little bit more control over exactly how much leverage or how much exposure we want to players. And then again, just give ourselves way more opportunities to build lineups with that player in it. So we're just visualizing this here at 20 lineups with 100% exposure to Adams. Obviously, we get 20 different combinations of Adams lineups. At 75 lineups, we can bring this down, right? And it actually already happens kind of automatically. You can kind of see this effect happening here, right? But we can bring Adams down maybe even further and only have 70% exposure to Adams while having 52 different lineup combinations that you use him. You can kind of start to visualize how more lineups just allows you to be target different angles on the slate, to be more nuanced with your exposures to certain players and to more comfortably make more moderate ownership and exposure decisions like this. So, I guess kind of coming full circle back down to this question. The very first thing that jumped out to me is I would recommend, if you're comfortable with it, dropping down in stakes here and spreading out that $60 of action that you're getting into more and more lineups to give yourself more opportunity for the high scoring lineup and allow you more ways to be nuanced with your exposures. In terms of editing things down, again, yeah, you're going to see sometimes there's going to be these plays that SaberSim has from between 80 to 100% exposure. And if that is too risky for you, that is often too risky for me. Use the leverage column to be kind of a guidepost of how to drop some of the exposure to some of these plays at the top. Make sure that both in direction, this is how I always like to say it, but in both direction and magnitude of the leverage column. So you have positive leverage on the plays you like the most. And also this number is the highest for the plays on the slate you like the most. Like, I mean, another example here would be like, no, Derrick Henry is my favorite play on the slate. I think he is going to kill it this week. That is the best play I think is on the slate. Well, then make him your highest leverage play. Make him have 50, make him show up in 50% of your lineups, right? He should be your highest. Okay, so maybe again, that might even just be a little bit too high, maybe 45 based on leverage. But like allow that player to be your favorite play on the slate. Let that leverage column guide you in terms of how much exposure you need to certain players and which players you want the most exposure to. Dan, hopefully this was helpful. I'll get you a timestamp recording of this particular stream so that you can watch this back. If you have any other follow-up questions for me, definitely just feel free to email us back and we'll jump back into this question. So, cool. I'm going to go ahead and hop into the next question I have. I had one more that came in through support, so we'll hit this one real quick and then we'll get to some of these questions that are coming in on Slack and YouTube chat. Welcome, everybody. I see we've had quite a few other people here join the stream now since I started on our first question. So thanks, everybody, for tuning in here. I hope you're having a good Thursday. But let's jump into this next question here. So this question was from Pratik, I think. Let me know if I am pronouncing that incorrectly. But the question is, I have a question regarding SaberSim percentile options. What is the difference between following these two methods of using this, and which one is more appropriate for large slate versus small slate GPPs? Option 1 is low sim variance, say at 3 with 75th percentile. Option 2 is high sim variance, say at 8 with average or median percentile. These are actually going to have very different outcomes. There's one that is much better than the other, but let me explain to you how this is working, at least as a starting point. So the way sim variance works, this is like a core kind of fundamental principle of how SaberSim works and a lot of the value behind SaberSim. The higher this slider goes, the smaller the random buckets of game simulations we are pulling from to determine the projections for every single player when we build every single lineup. This is easiest seen at the extreme. So at 10, we simulate every game play-by-play thousands of times. And at sim variance 10, we're going to pull a single game simulation out for every single game on the slate and use those players' projections that they scored in that single game simulation, and then build the lineup around it. The lineup from there will take into account correlation and ownership fade based on how high you have those individual sliders, but the projections used for those players will be from the single game simulations. At 0, we're just going to use the average projections, which is the average of, and essentially we are going to bucket every single average game simulation for each player when we build the lineup. So the effect of this is that at higher levels, you get lineups that have much higher upside at the expense of average performance, right? Because you will get lineups where you get the single game sim where Justin Jefferson catches 3 touchdowns, right? Or Derrick Henry runs for 250 yards and things like that, right? You get those upside games starting to show up down here. Everybody is locked into their average, right? The effective average projections is much higher and you have lower upside, but your average performance of those lineups will be higher. So what you are doing, if you were to put your sim variance down here, is you are taking a weight of game sims that is pretty heavily weighted to the average projection, right? This is not going to allow a variety of diversity of game outcomes in your sims. You're going to have lineups that are pretty well focused on the particular average game outcomes. You're also not going to have a very diverse pool of lineups. And if we were to build this, let's just use a smaller pool just to get the build done quickly. So when we build this particular thing, when we go and set the percentiles at 75th, we are going to take the lineups that were built using buckets of game sims that were large and heavily weighted towards the averages. And then when we change the percentiles to 75th, which I'll do here in a minute, we're going to update the player projections of all of those lineups to what their 75th percentile outcome is. and it's going to change the way the Saber score is calculated. It's probably going to change the way the lineups are sorted. We are making an assumption here based of these lineups that every single player in the lineup scores their 75th percentile outcome, and then ask ourselves now which lineup is best. And this is not the optimal really way to do this. Let me let this build finish. I'll show you how we actually do that, and kind of restate what I just said, and then we'll bounce back over to the other option because it'll be easier to see why the other option is better. So, okay, so this build is done, right? Low sim variance. We're going to change the percentile up to 75th, and now we're going to take these lineups that are pretty heavily weighted towards average projections and update them and show basically the projections or the values as if every single player in the lineup hit their 75th percentile outcome. And the main reason why this doesn't really make a lot of sense, I guess, is because we're taking players and we're taking game simulations that are built on the averages and then just sorting the lineups based on like a what if potential if every player had that 75th percentile outcome. And we don't really need to do that because at higher sim variance levels, we actually take into account the real ranges of outcomes of players in a more realistic way, right? This is actually probably more reminiscent, or what the kind of lineups you're going to get out of here are actually probably going to more resemble how a traditional optimizer might try to deal with the problem of upside by using ceiling projections for players, for example, and then just optimizing based on the ceiling projections. It makes a pretty bad, I guess, assumption overall that what it takes to win a GPP with a lineup is every single player in the lineup having a 75th percentile outcome or an 85th or a 95th percentile outcome. And that's not actually really accurate, right? We want to instead look at the legitimate ways the slate might play out, where there is a mix of players having their 25th percentile outcome and their 99th percentile outcome and their 45th percentile outcome and their 85th percentile outcome. And certain teams and stacks are all going to have these outcomes. And then to build the best lineups for those given potential slate outcomes. And that's the way sim variance really works. And that's kind of the way it is designed, is that we're going to bucket and take different combinations of each individual game and then build the best lineups around them. It doesn't so much make sense to say, what are the best lineups I can make if every player playing in every single game hits their 75th percentile outcome or their 85th percentile outcome? Because well, first of all, that particular situation is incredibly unlikely to happen. But even if it is, it's really only just one. Even if it does happen, it's really just one potential other slate outcome in the big mix of the grand scheme of how many different outcomes can come out. It's better in general to say, show me everything, give me everything that can possibly happen, and then let's take out different random kind of buckets of ways this slate could play out and build the best lineups around that. So now let's run our build here. Or actually, let's go back to the build we ran at the start of the stream because this one was done at 8. So when we're looking at this build, right? So this was built with sim variance 8. This still says smart diversity, but it's sim variance, right? So now we're going to, each of these lineups that we're seeing here corresponds to a small given subset of individual game simulations for every game on the slate. So we've clearly got, some of these games where the Giants and Cowboys game really goes off, but we're mixing in the Joe Burrow stacks, right? These lineups are not built with this underlying assumption that every player in this lineup and every player in the slate is hitting their ceiling. It's instead, actually looking at possible slate outcomes and building the best overall lineup we can given that particular set of outcomes. So this approach number 2, high sim variance with an average percentile, is a much better approach to building GPP lineups. And I guess in this particular case, it is also worth noting, why wouldn't I then just go in and also set the percentile to 85th, 75th, something like a ceiling thing? And the primary answer is at this point, it doesn't really matter because we've already captured the upside by leveraging the simulations themselves. This lineup here, for example, that is shown here. And actually, I am thinking that I have discovered a minor bug here because these actually now look like 75th percentiles. I think I have discovered a minor bug where switching between builds actually switches the percentiles as well. But regardless, let's go back. Let's change this back, and I think it will work. It doesn't really matter if we have updated the percentiles. Let's see. In the post-build process, when we're running a build with... Does this look better now? Yeah, this looks a lot better. It doesn't really matter if we've adjusted the percentiles here at this point in the post-build process, because the game simulations we have leveraged already express that natural upside when we built the lineup, right? The game simulations that were pulled in randomly to build this particular lineup obviously express a situation where the Bengals and Packers game is the game stack, the successful game stack of the slate, right? So we don't need to say, okay, now show me what this lineup or what the best lineup is that uses a 75th percentile outcome, because these players already had ceiling outcomes. That's why they ended up in the lineup. So the best thing I can recommend percentiles can be useful for in this post-build process is to turn it up to a ceiling outcome. And sometimes I think it's just interesting to look at what these lineups look like and look at what the scores look like for these particular outcomes and then check them against your assumptions. That I think can be pretty interesting. And like, an interesting way of doing this is looking at something like an 85th percentile outcome and saying, are these realistic Giants outcomes, for example? Right. If I'm going to play some Daniel Jones on this particular slate, am I confident in this particular number being his 15% or less ceiling outcome? And just kind of checking these against your assumptions can be kind of useful, but you don't need to use these, and I don't think they actually really much increase your upside very much at all. So, but a really good question, and it's a question that comes in pretty often. So, cool. All right, so those were the two questions I had that came in through support. I'm going to go ahead and jump into these questions that came in through Slack. There were a few minor questions that have come in since yesterday that it looks like a lot of people have already answered, but I am just going to chime in briefly on these just to make sure that everybody hears these. But David asked, what is a double stack with a bringback? And this one was one that was asked in Slack. I'm sure David heard me mention this yesterday's strategy session stream. Double stack with a bringback is really just a way of basically saying this particular stacking rule. QB +2 with one player on the other side. It's a very common stack in NFL DFS. It is the quarterback with two of his pass catchers with one player on the other side, basically chasing the idea that there is a quarterback that, if he is successful, is likely to make two of his other pass catchers successful on the same team. And given that one team in the game is having offensive success, the other team is either going to be encouraged to chase, right, and either try to put up points and throw the ball more, so it makes sense to have another player on the other side. Or you can take it from the lens of, if Dak Prescott has the reason to be throwing the ball a ton in this game, it is likely that it is because the Giants already scored a lot. So somebody on that Giants side has to be responsible for doing that. And that's kind of the same thinking here, right? You can take this really either way. Rodgers is having a big game and having a lot of success throwing the ball to Adams and Cobb, which means Burrow has to throw a lot of passes to stay in the game, which makes Boyd a likely candidate to be successful. Or the other way around, the Bengals go up early. They're having a lot of success on offense. Boyd is likely to benefit from that, which makes Rodgers have to continue to throw the ball. It's basically these game scripts that end up creating these particular outcomes. And you'll see that this is often a pretty common stack type with default settings. It's maybe not always the number one most common stack type. It doesn't always work for every single team, but it's a very common one. So good question there. There was also a follow-up question from Rusty here about our strategy session we did yesterday, and it looks like Max already answered this one, but I'll chime in here as well. So he said, as an example, and again, this is more of a follow-up from yesterday's stream. So he said, as an example, Ram said they want to get more opportunities for Woods. Would that lead for you to slightly bump up his projection to get more exposure, or would you increase his ownership, since everyone probably heard this also? And Max basically said you can do both of these things and allow SaberSim to decide if you want to get leverage on him. And I think that's a really good point. I think in this particular case, if I was looking at this, I think this is a really good find. And I would probably, so like a really good way of doing this here. Let's go look at the game tonight. So the coach says they want to get Woods more involved. And one thing we can look at is how do our projections currently, we talked about this on stream yesterday, but how do our projections currently like think about the Rams pass catchers, right? So let's look at like the wide receivers for the Rams. Can I still do this? Yeah. Okay. So receptions, right? So like, yeah, at the moment, we have Kupp with almost 3 more average receptions than Woods. So I do think this is a good opportunity. Let's go over to the flex instead here to say, maybe this is a little bit closer and maybe the edge between Woods and Kupp is actually a little bit lower. Maybe we bump Woods up to 1698. And I think you could even take the zero sum stance that we were talking yesterday and drop Kupp's down a little bit with the assumption that this is going to balance out a little bit. Now, if this was something you were consistently hearing, right, or you felt that this was starting to make its way around the industry, at that point, I think it would be a good idea to also look at the ownership. In this particular case, me personally, based on what I'm seeing today, I still think Kupp is going to be way more owned than Woods. So I would probably just do this. But if you saw that Woods, especially given his salary, was starting to become kind of the more popular play, then maybe you think about bumping up the ownership as well and maybe give him a little bit of a bump at captain too, something like that. But really good question there as well. Just wanted to chime in with my 2 cents on that. This is another good question from Matt, and another one also that Max already answered here, but I want to chime in as well. And he said, when entering your own projections, what does the sim do to generate multiple diverse lineups? Assuming some math around standard deviation, et cetera. Also assuming that there's no percentile differences. Thanks. Yeah, so I guess, first off, I mentioned here before, but I'll kind of reiterate. It's important to first know exactly the way that we're building the lineups, period. And the main thing that affects that is sim variance. So again, in summary of what sim variance is doing is at higher values, we're using smaller buckets of random game simulations to determine the projections for each players when we build every single lineup, right? So at like a level like 8, the default value for a 20 max over 50,000 people, we're going to use fairly small random buckets of game sims. And those will be the projections. The average projections of that set of game sims will be the projections used for that lineup, right? We have a full range of outcomes of players for every possible outcome that they have. Well, for realistically, the vast majority of every outcome that they have on the slate. So you might get this sim and this sim and this sim for Devontae Adams, right? And his average may end up being in that particular set of game sims over here, right? Somewhere like this. And that's going to be a really good play. He's going to he's going to score 32 points. Rodgers probably also had a good game, and maybe you get a Packer stack in that particular lineup. So that's the way sim variance works, right? At lower values, you get more weighted, you get bigger buckets. So maybe at sim variance 2, instead of just getting like 3 Adams, you get the entire section of game sims from here to here, right? So the average ends up being around here or something like that, right? The upside potential, the impact of big ceiling games is diminished in that particular set because there's so many game sims that are being included in that player's projection when we build the lineup. So what happens when you use custom projections? Well, let's say we adjusted Devontae Adams. We thought this was a little bit too bullish and we're a little bit under on Devontae Adams and we drop him by 2 points. What we do then is we're going to take every single Packers-Bengals game sim, and in each one of them, we are going to drop Devontae Adams' points output by 2, by the same difference that you change the projections by. So you still get the value of using the whole wealth of simulation data. We're still pulling from the game sims, but we've edited each one by the same difference that you've edited the mean of all of them, which is this particular number. So this question has actually come in frequently over the past couple of weeks. So I want to probably end up spending some time and recording like a video that dives into this in detail. But I think the main points or the main concerns that I hear from people is that editing projections is going to mess something up in the sims, and that is not the case. You are still taking advantage of our simulation data when you are editing projections. Now, the most important thing to note is, obviously make sure that your edits to projections are plus EV, that they are improvements to our projections. If you go in and make dramatic projection changes that are less accurate than what we have by default, then your lineups are going to be worse. But there's no reason to believe necessarily that you are inherently making anything worse by editing projections. You are not. You're still using the game sims. So there was a question here. This is also another common question. This is from Lundar. And he said, I'm maxing out a 150 lineup entry. Is it possible to say, keep 25 lineups where I made a particular input adjustment, change the game total, ran it and save that run, then another sim with different inputs and save that, so on 6 different sims of 25 lineups and mass enter them all into 150 lineups. So Matthias here responded and basically said that the way to do this is to download all those individual lineup CSVs and then combine them in your entries file. And that is right now at the moment the easiest way to do that. There is no way in the entry editor itself to combine lineups from different builds that all go into the same contest. This has been something I have heard from users before, but it would, or a request I've heard from users before, but it does require a bit of fairly significant re-architecturing of the way that the entry editor is built to support something like that. So that's actually a little bit of a bigger project, but I can see us doing something like that in the future. At the moment, you got to get your hands dirty in the CSVs to do that. So Pratik had another question here, and he said, is there a place where I can find distribution for projections, distribution for receiving yards, receptions, rushing yards, etc.? I don't believe there is an easy way to just visually see all of that information here in the app. The easiest way I think you could at least explore that info would be going to the betting app if you have access to it. This is an add-on to the DFS app, right? That gives you bets for the team totals and things like that, but also props. And if you were to go to the prop side, this is hosted on the classic app for now while we work on getting it ported over. But on the prop side, you could here then basically kind of explore, just using like roughly even odds. Say something like, let's say I want to see like what are the percent of what are the percent of game sims where Chris Carson has more than maybe receptions would be like an interesting one. 3.5. That's probably a little high, right? But you could still do this. Okay, so we're basically saying in the game sims that Chris Carson is getting more than 3.5 receptions only 10% of the time, right? And you could kind of, I realize if you were trying to find like a big export of this data and see probably like distributions of these games for every single stat for every single player on the slate, this isn't really going to satisfy that. But if you have particular players that you're looking into, this would be the easiest way of doing it. And I would recommend checking out. There's a free trial for the sports betting tool. If you are in the app here and you go up to my account, you can add it right here, add to plan. And that's actually a pretty creative use for it, using the prop calculator to calculate these kinds of things and look into that. So, okay. So, Dice Hawk here has a good question. Oops. And he said, as SaberSim updates projections and runs simulations throughout the week, do new builds need to be run to incorporate the updates? Asked another way, is it a bad idea to run your final builds and update your player exposures before the end of the week? For example, Saturday night, Sunday morning, I believe I've had situations where players are left in the SaberSim lineups, even when their projections have been updated to 0 because they're out, for example. It is always best to run your lineups after the final sims have run for a given slate. The reason why, so first of all, I should mention here, let's go back to the app. Let's go back to DFS. And we'll go back to the main slate here. And let's pull up one of the builds. Let's pull up the build we ran at the start of the show here. So you'll see, right, we'll pull up this build, and what will probably happen here Okay, so this refresh button is still here, right? And we can click this, and within this build, update all of our projections to the most recent sims we have for every player. And it will legitimately change the player projections. It won't overwrite custom projections, but it will legitimately change the player projections to match the most recent sims. And it will resort your lineups, and it'll kind of rethink what are now the best lineups I can play. The problem, though, is that the full pool of 500 lineups was built on information that is now out of date. So if significant news has changed, one of the ways that I like to just show this, for example, is if Davante Adams, for example, got ruled out. Now, we would refresh our projections, and all these lineups that have no Davante Adams would get floated to the top, and you wouldn't have any Davante Adams. But we would basically just lose 224 lineups, 44.8% of our entire pool, because the lineups still exist, and the entire pool was built on this faulty information that Davante Adams was going to play in this particular case. So it is always best to rebuild your lineups after the final information has basically come out. There is, I think for football, the sims they run when inactives come out for each game, but then there's like a final game sim that is running an hour before the games start. After that particular game sim runs, I would build your final build, and I would do it with a fresh build to capture the latest data. Now, from there, it is okay, I think, if very minor news breaks, or even if no news breaks in particular, but a new sim runs that might reflect a very minor adjustment to the model or something like that, then I think is a good opportunity to just use the update projection so you have the most recent data, right? The most recent like projections themselves in your pool of lineups, and you're working from that when you put your lineups into your contests, right? So it's kind of two things. One, I definitely want to stress that you should build your lineups. You should rebuild your lineups when news breaks, when things like inactives come out, lineup cards come out for baseball, starting lineups come out for things like basketball, right? You should be rebuilding a pool so that your pool of lineups is up to date. If there are minor things that are coming out, but I guess if there are minor things after that, you don't need to rebuild a full pool every single time. And even put another way, I wouldn't wait 5 minutes, 10 minutes before lock necessarily, and potentially put yourself in a situation where you are missing lock or have no time to actually add any value to the process because you were waiting for the last and final sim. The umpire sims in baseball are a really good example. So on the first games of series in baseball, a lot of times who's the actual home plate umpire that affects the pitcher, and how strikes and balls and things like that are called. A lot of times that doesn't come out until like a half hour before the game starts, even if the lineup cards are out much earlier than that. So you will see sometimes these sims that will run even after the lineups have been confirmed for both teams in the game that say umpire changed. That really isn't going to like put yourself in a situation where you have lineups that are just dead. It's a very minor tweak to the players playing in that game, and it's probably plenty to just run your lineups when the lineup cards are out, and then if you need to, just update your projections in the build itself to capture the latest information from that umpire sim. So anyway, I feel like that was a wordy answer to a very basic question. The basic answer, the short answer is always rebuild your lineups after significant builds or significant changes have come out. Like definitely if you've built lineups on Saturday night, you need to start over with a fresh build Sunday morning after the inactives come out. So cool. Let's see. So there was a question from Elusive Smoke, and again, kind of similar question here. So Smoke, don't know if you are watching this here or if you've been watching the rest of the stream. I think I've covered this one in enough detail here. But I think I've covered this in enough detail throughout the rest of the stream. Again, so like I guess real quickly, the Spark Notes version of this is that a player's projection, when you see this, Kyler Murray, 24.89, is an average of every single game sim we have for the player, right? And then when we build you lineups based on your sim variance slider, we're pulling from these actual game sims randomly and in smaller buckets, the higher that slider goes, to capture real upside and variance in your actual individual lineups. Custom projections are going to shift every single game sim we have for the player by the difference of your custom projection to the mean projection. If you increase the mean projection by 2, we're going to increase every single game sim by 2, and then use those values when we build lineups. So and then there was another question here about college football here from Smoke. He said, can you take a look at making rules on FanDuel college football? I want to make a rule to pair the QB in the Superflex with a wide receiver. Is that possible right now? It's a good question. Not NFL, college football. Let's see. Only 2-game slate. We will try this. So let's say we'll just use salary-based projections. Stacking. Okay, so we only have the basic stack rules on college football. I don't know if there is, to be completely honest, or a way to like force that, unfortunately. Yeah, I don't know if there's going to be an easy way to force it, right? Because we could say like we want this particular stack, but because it is a super flex and any player can be used there, it could very easily just pair 2 receivers together rather than the quarterback and the receiver here. So I think I can see exactly why you want to do that. I think the goal here is to bring the new advanced stacking rules and just maybe a better updated approach to stacking for college football in general. But there's obviously a much bigger initiative with college football of projecting the sport. So I know college football has gotten much bigger and bigger from the DFS standpoint here in the past couple of years. It is becoming a sport that we hear a lot of requests about and a lot of questions and things like that. So I will pass this along as well, and I can see why this would be useful. I think it will end up probably being a little bit wrapped up too into just us committing more resources to the college football product here. The super flexes definitely make things a little bit interesting there. So we'll have to think about the way to do that. But at the moment, I don't think that's a great way to do it. I would be curious if we just build some lineups here. I'm curious too, like how FanDuel actually marks these players or treats these players, right? Like, is there a way to identify QBs in the superflex position? So there is. Okay, so I mean, I know this is going to be really tedious, and I'm sure you have probably even kind of just thought about this, but the easiest thing to do here would be to just uncheck the players. So you could set, okay, so let's start over. So you could theoretically set the rules and basically say, okay, so first of all, you need at least, I guess in theory, 2 players from the same team where one is the QB and receiver, right? And then you could set another rule and say you also need 2 players from the same team where one is the wide receiver and the super flex, right? So now we have 2 rules, and now we build, and then you could go in here in the post-build process and remove super flexes that weren't QBs. And that is probably the easiest wraparound way of getting this done at the moment with the limited tools that we have. So let's see if it works, but I think it will, right? Okay, so now we can go in and remove wide receiver, running back, wide receiver. Okay, so now it should work out. Too late. Maybe it didn't. Huh. QB plus, so every lineup should have the QB Houston plus a wide receiver Houston. This is just a 2-game slate too, so I'm wondering if it's just getting jammed up, but it seems like it did things that we wouldn't have theoretically wanted here, right? Like it used a Houston QB in the super flex spot, but he's paired with a running back. So that's not really working the way I thought it would work either. Sometimes the order of these can matter a little bit too. Let's see if we prioritize first instead this, and then prioritize this. See if we can force it that way. I'm just experimenting with this here too, because now I'm curious of the best way to do this. I think the other thing that's really interesting for these niche sports too is that just like there's just not a lot of people that are playing these in a way that's sound or optimal. So I'm always interested in trying to figure out exactly how we can get this kind of stuff totally right with the tools that we have. Okay, so now let's look. No, so it doesn't seem to be, it seems like maybe it's just not picking up the positions correctly, right? Because here's another example, right? Like we're using this 2-lane QB and he's not paired with a receiver, so it's not really working correctly. No, so unfortunately, even with the tools that we have at the moment here, Smoke, it doesn't. Yeah, so Elusive Smoke said I tried that and couldn't get it to override. Currently using my own optimizer instead. Yeah, I totally see how this would be useful. And it's a little unfortunate that even with the basic stacking rules, it isn't working as intended. I think the goal here is like a bigger kind of overhaul to the stacking rules for college football to get these to work better, to play a little bit nicer here, because it's just not working totally the right way. So, but we want to make an overall investment into the college football product, because I know it's getting bigger and bigger, and the prize pools are getting bigger, and the popularity there on the DFS side is continuing to grow. So I'm going to move on for now. This is a question from Ryan here, and he said, baseball playoff question, do you prefer playing the 2-game slate or playing the individual showdowns? That's a good question. I think in general, when these slates are, especially when they're 2-game or less, I think I prefer showdown than 2-game classic slates. At 3 games, I think they start to get more interesting. Like I'm thinking even for football, right? The Thanksgiving Day slate with the 3 games is, I play pretty much everything on Thanksgiving because I'm a degen, but I think the 3-game classic slate is more fun than the individual showdowns. But on 2 games, it's hard. And I think the showdowns actually maybe provide a little bit more interesting things from a game theory standpoint than the classics. One thing that I think would probably be like my determining factor here would be the contests that are available. So I'm not playing baseball today. We've got the Thursday night showdown. That's enough, or the Thursday night football showdown. That's enough for me. But like from a contest selection standpoint, I'd probably be most interested in what contests were best. And stuff's probably actually pretty full now because these games start here in an hour and a half or so. But that would probably be my metric. Like this isn't even a very good quarter juke, less than 500 effective entrants. Even worse here. Not that much better here. But again, stuff is probably already filled up quite a bit. Like this actually might be the second quarter juke. It wouldn't surprise me if, given the scheduling of these particular games, if the Boston at Tampa Bay showdown game had the best contests of every single slate for baseball today. Because these two are in the middle of the day when people are at work. This is the primetime game. Like it would make sense to me. So this would probably be the one I would have ended up playing if I were to just play one, because I bet the showdowns were better. So, but yeah, I don't know. I'll probably continue to keep an eye out on how the contests look for baseball. I'm really trying at this point in the baseball season, just with like, especially with football going on, like I think they're pretty sharp fields, and I'm mostly just going to stick to contests that grade out with 1,000 or more effective entrants, and I think are soft enough because it's tough at this point in the season. I think these fields are pretty sharp. So cool. All right, sweet. Let's hit some of these questions that came in YouTube chat. Phil said, why do most pro players play on DraftKings? I think most pros play like almost anywhere they can get action, right? The pros, literally people that are, making at least a portion of their living off of DFS winnings are probably everywhere. But DraftKings has the biggest prizes in general. I think FanDuel is competitive with them on the bigger sports like NFL, but across the board, DraftKings has the biggest contests and the biggest prize pools. Probably also has the sharpest fields in general. But that is probably why a lot of the content you're going to see is geared towards DK first, right? It's the biggest contest, biggest prizes, probably the biggest user base as well. So, Cody said, my question with that is if we update the mean here, let me jump back to SaberSim. We update the mean projection by 2 and the sim that is pulled is going to have a high percentile outcome. Shouldn't that be upped by more than 2 points? Perhaps I misunderstood. I get what you are saying here, right? Like the actual impact should be weighted by more. Let me think about this here for a second. I wonder if Matt or I wonder if maybe Matt or Will might have a more mathematical answer to why it is this way, right? Like basically, I think let's pull up Adams again. So if we increased him by 2, right, and that's taking place at his mean, wouldn't that increase result in a significant more higher ceiling here? So, okay, here's what I believe the reason is that this range of outcomes is kind of pure in a sense. And if we shift every single individual game simulation, we basically shift the full, I'm trying to make sure I'm in the camera. We shift the full set, the full range of outcomes by a little bit in one direction, right? But the graph, the curve is untouched. If you start scaling that increase or decrease in projection to different spots on the graph, you are actually going to skew and change the range of outcomes of the player. And you are going to misrepresent the percent chance of a player having certain outcomes because you have affected the range of outcomes curve itself, right? If we say we're going to increase Davante Adams' projection by 2 at his mean, but 4 at his 85th percentile outcome, you actually change the percentage of time that a player scores. You disproportionately change the percentage of the time that player scores that particular set of outcomes. The range of outcomes has now been changed by custom projections. Put another way, the primary concern that people have when they upload custom projections is that they are disrupting the purity of the sims, and scaling that adjustment to different outputs, to different scores, would actually have that effect. You would disrupt the impact of the sims, right? In this way, you don't. Let me know if that makes sense, Cody. That I think, and I may run this by Matt or Will and see what they think too, but I think that's the best answer I have to that, is that you can think about this as updating a player's projection is just going to shift this entire outcome curve a little bit to the right. Decreasing the average projection, decreasing the projection would shift it all just a little bit to the left. But doing anything other than that, changing the outcomes differently, is going to change the range of outcomes curve itself. Cody said, I'm thinking this must be naturally shown because if he's projected for 10 and you change it to 12, the highest outcome, so the highest outcome does go from 30 to 32, right? In that particular case, his highest ceiling outcome. So it looks like there's maybe like one tiny game sim where Davante Adams scores over 60, which is crazy, but he'd probably be the guy to do it. That would also go up by just a tiny bit. But anyway, I'm gonna tackle this question real quick from Lundar here. He said, using your earlier example, if you were to drop Adams' projections by 2 points, but left the game total the same, would it theoretically bump the other player's projections, even if just fractionally? It wouldn't literally bump the other player's projections. In other words, if we lower Adams, right, it is not as if Aaron Jones literally in his own particular set of outcomes, it is not as if he now is projected higher, but relatively he is. So like when you pull sets of game sims where the Packers score a lot of points and both Jones and Adams have good games, the impact of those Jones ceiling games compared relatively to the Adams ceiling games will be higher now. And you may get more Jones in your lineups as a result, right? But it does not, the other Packers players are not literally affected by manually adjusting Adams. Now, if you were to adjust the team total, which is another way of doing this, right? We could adjust the Packers team down and maybe say they're going to score 25 instead. And then click yes, we will adjust the entire Packers team based on what, oh, I had a custom projection for Adams. Did that fix? Okay, wait. Where did he go? Okay, hold on. I did something. I messed something up there. Let's go back. Because I had a custom projection for Adams. So. What? I don't know what happened there. Okay. Am I crazy? Did Adams like just get ruled out or something crazy? I'll check on that. Let's do this with a different player. I don't know what's going on there. Let's look at the Vikings. That's kind of weird. I'll figure out what's going on there. But let's say, for example, we wanted to so we've just got the Vikings here, and let's say we just wanted to reduce them down to 27, right? Okay, so all of these players now are going to drop here accordingly, right? Based on the change to the game team total. So in this particular case, since we've adjusted the team, every player's projection has dropped for the most part. Yeah. So, and that also actually has an effect on the Lions because they're playing in the same game. So the Lions' projections may have changed. So Goff actually goes down by a tiny bit. Swift goes up, right? You get kind of inconsistent results here on the other team, but they're affected too. So let's just do this. Reset all. I think that will probably fix this. And Adams is back 2 now. So for some reason, I somehow must have set him to 0. But Cody said, I'll think on this a little more. It doesn't make a ton of sense to me. Yeah, and I'll check with maybe some other. I will ask Matt and Will, who will probably be able to give the most articulate answer of why this is the way it is. Again, I do think the main reason why is because we don't want to affect the curve itself, right? We don't want to change the range of outcomes curve, but I think there's probably a more articulate way of explaining that, right? So. Yeah, and I'll think on that too. And maybe I'll have a better way of discussing this in tomorrow's stream. So anyway, though, guys, we are right at about an hour here. So another great stream today. Thank you, everybody that asked questions, participated, was here to watch or listen. And I know everybody that is going to be listening to this later. Thank you as well. I will be back here again tomorrow, 2 p.m. Eastern, doing another show for Friday. Good luck if you are playing any baseball contest tonight. Good luck if you're playing the Thursday night showdown. And we will be right back here again tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern. So have a good rest of your day. See you guys. Thanks.